6 decades ago, the ground beneath one of the busiest holiday coasts in Europe was arid volcanic scrub where almost nobody lived. Today, that same coast sits at the heart of the Canary Islands tourism economy, an industry worth more than 21 billion euros a year. And in 2024, the island it belongs to declared to its own people that it was running out of water. In a single lifetime, a barren strip of southern Tenerife became a billion-dollar empire, built by importing almost everything except the one thing it could never make for itself. The paradox is built into the place itself. Tenerife has no rivers and no lakes worth the name. What fresh water it has, it drags out of the volcanic rock through hundreds of hand-cut tunnels driven deep into the mountains. And onto this waterless coast, the 20th century poured hotels and swimming pools and golf courses and millions of visitors a year, every one of whom needed to drink and wash and cool down in a place that had never once been able to supply itself. The very thing that made the island's south rich, an endless supply of visitors, is now costing it the one resource it has never had in abundance. That engine runs through the whole of this story, from the first hotel to the last march on the beach. In the middle of the 1960s, two men, a father and his son, looked out over an almost empty stretch of the South Tenerife coast and set out to build a resort there from nothing. Within 60 years, the tourism they helped begin was worth more than 21 billion euros a year to the Canary Islands, close to 37% of everything the islands earn. Southern Tenerife alone now holds more than 9 in every 10 tourist beds on the island. And that same span of years ended with the island government declaring a water emergency, its reservoirs barely a third full. To see how improbable all of that is, start with the price. The land that today carries some of the most valuable hotel ground in Spain was sold, in serviced plots, for 500 pesetas a square metre, a handful of pounds, in the money of the day, for a coast that would be worth a fortune within a generation. Tenerife is the largest of the Canary Islands, a cluster of Spanish volcanoes rising out of the Atlantic off the coast of northwest Africa, closer to the Sahara than to mainland Spain. At its centre stands its great volcano, Teide, the highest peak in all of Spain, a little over 3,700 metres of dormant mountain that pulls the clouds towards it. Those clouds are the reason the island wears two faces. The north is green and humid, and it was there, for most of the island's modern history, that the money and the visitors went to genteel resort towns like Puerto de la Cruz, where wealthy northern Europeans had been taking the air since the days of steamships. The south, sitting in the rain shadow of the mountain, is dry, sun-blasted and blindingly bright, a country of black lava, low scrub and cactus. For centuries it was the forgotten quarter of the island, the place the rain never reached and the good roads never quite arrived. The islands had been inhabited for thousands of years before Spain ever reached them, by a people called the Guanche, and were folded into the Spanish crown only at the very end of the 15th century. But even across all that time, the dry south stayed the emptiest and poorest corner of Tenerife, the last place on the island that anyone chose to call home. The makers of a certain kind of holiday brochure like to say there was nothing in the south before the hotels came. That is not quite true. This coast had a small, hard-working life of its own. Los Cristianos, the fishing village that sat right beside the future resort, had a harbour recorded as far back as the 16th century, and its first permanent houses by the 1860s. Its men fished the Atlantic and traded along the coast in small boats. Inland and along the shore there were tomato plantations and banana groves grown for export, a resin factory, and salt pans worked to preserve the catch. From 1914, fresh water was piped down from the highland town of Villaflor to make any of that farming possible at all. This was a poor, dry, lived-in shore with work and water of its own, a long way from the blank volcanic rock of the brochures. The first outsiders to see something valuable in that dryness came for their health, not their holidays. In 1956, by one account, a Swedish writer and broadcaster named Bengt Relander arrived in Los Cristianos suffering from multiple sclerosis, drawn by the promise of warm, dry, unchanging air that the damp cold of Scandinavia could never offer. Others followed him south, so many of them that the main street through the old village was eventually named the Avenue of Sweden, and in 1965 a rehabilitation clinic for Northern Europeans, named for the winter sun that had drawn them south, opened its doors on the coast. The south of Tenerife began, in other words, as a place people travelled to in order to get well, years before anyone thought of it as a place to relax. The notion that it might become something far larger came next, and it did not come from Spain. In 1964, a joint Belgian and Canarian venture began building a holiday complex called Ten Bell, a little along the coast, at a place with the faintly ominous name of the Coast of Silence. It came just as Spain was throwing open its doors. From the end of the 1950s, the country had begun courting foreign holidaymakers in earnest, and the package deal, a flight and a full-board hotel sold together for one low price, was already turning the mainland coasts into machines for the manufacture of sunshine. It was modest by what would follow, but it proved a crucial point. Northern Europeans really would fly to this baked and empty shoreline, and they would pay to stay on it. It was the working prototype. The full-scale version, the one that would eventually swallow the entire coast, was already being drawn up a few miles away. The man drawing it up was neither a hotelier nor a local grandee. Rafael Puig Levina was a Catalan industrialist, and he arrived on the south coast in 1965. Reportedly, he took control of something close to 2.3 million square metres of that arid ground, an estate the size of a small town, through an introduction made by a local builder. In June of 1966, he and his son Santiago registered a company to develop it, and they gave both the company and the future resort a single, deliberate, entirely invented name. They called it Playa de las Americas, the beach of the Americas. There was no historical America here. The name was pure marketing, chosen, by one account, because the Canary Islands were the last landfall European ships had made on their way to the New World, and because a name that whispered Miami and the wide Atlantic sold package holidays in Stockholm and Oslo far better than a stretch of Tenerife lava ever could. It was a piece of salesmanship years ahead of its time. By the moment the first foundations were dug, the place already had a brand, an invented name, and a story to sell, and not yet a single hotel to sell it in. Then came the selling of the ground. Rafael laid out serviced plots along the shore and passed them on at that near symbolic 500 pesetas, a square metre, to developers willing to gamble, among them a hotelier named Candido Garcia San Juan. 5,000 palm trees were shipped in from Elche on the Spanish mainland to soften the volcanic ground and make it look like the paradise the brochures had already promised. In 1968, the first phases of a special development plan were approved. On paper, a city was rising on land that had grown little but tomatoes. Rafael himself did not live to see it finished. He died in 1974, at the age of 59, with the resort that carried his borrowed name still climbing out of the dust, and his son carried the work on, by then wealthy enough to have married a Canarian former beauty queen, once crowned Miss Spain, and to have settled into a grand villa on the coast. The first Grand Hotel opened on the 10th of July, 1972. It was called the Grand Tinef, 4 stars and 360 rooms facing the sea, and its swimming pools were designed by Cesar Manrique, the Canarian artist whose taste shaped so much of what the islands would come to look like. It was a statement of ambition, and it drew a remarkable endorsement almost at once. Within months, by one account, the future King of Spain, then Prince Juan Carlos, and his wife Sofia brought their 3 children to stay for 4 days. For a resort that had existed only as lines on a plan a few years before, a royal family on the sun lounges was worth more than any advertisement money could buy, and word of it travelled fast through the circles that mattered. And then there is the sand. If you have ever lain on a beach at Las Americas, you have almost certainly been told that the golden grains beneath you were shipped across the sea from the Sahara because the island's own sand is black volcanic grit. It is the single most repeated fact about the whole resort. It is also wrong. The first beaches of Las Americas, with names like Troya and El Bobo, were never covered in imported African sand. What actually happened was a feat of engineering. 2 Spanish engineers, Juan Alfredo Amigo and Jose Luis Olcina, designed angled stone breakwaters, long jutting arms of rock whose exact shape was modelled in a laboratory in Grenoble, in France, so that the sea itself would sweep the local sand into the new bays and hold it there against the tide. Not a single cubic metre, one of the engineers later said, was brought in from anywhere else. The story of the Saharan sand is perfectly true. It simply belongs to a different beach, on the far side of the island. Away to the northeast, near the capital of Santa Cruz, the district of San Andres wanted a proper golden beach of its own, and in the early 1970s it got one. Something like 270,000 tons of pale sand were carried across the water from the old Spanish Sahara, from near the town of El Ain, moved in roughly 5 million sacks aboard a single ship and paid for with a loan of 50 million pesetas. That beach, called Las Teresitas, opened in 1973, and it is the true source of the legend that later drifted south and fastened itself onto Las Americas. The most famous fact about the resort actually happened on the other side of the island entirely. For all its hotels and its royal guests, the young resort still had one crippling weakness. The island had a single airport, Los Rodeos, and it sat up in the north, more than 600 metres above the sea, in a place where cloud and fog could roll across the runway with almost no warning. To reach the reliable sunshine of the south, every visitor had first to fly into the murk of the north and then cross the length of the island by winding road. The case for a second airport down in the clear, dry south had been argued for years, and by the middle of the 1970s the work on one had already begun. Then came the day that turned a practical argument into an unanswerable one, and it remains, nearly half a century on, the deadliest single accident in the history of human flight. On the 27th of March 1977, a bomb planted by a Canary Islands independence group forced the closure of the airport on neighbouring Gran Canaria. Its flights were diverted to Los Rodeos, which quickly filled with aircraft it had never been built to hold. Among them were two Boeing 747 jumbo jets, one flown by the Dutch airline KLM and one by the American carrier Pan Am. Thick fog then dropped over the crowded airfield. In the murk, the KLM jet began its takeoff run down the very runway along which the Pan Am jet was still slowly taxiing. The two collided at speed. 583 people were killed, 248 of them aboard the Dutch aircraft and 335 aboard the American one. 61 people survived, and every one of them came from the Pan Am jet. In the decades since, no crash anywhere on Earth has come close to that toll. The catastrophe at Los Rodeos did not, on its own, build the airport in the south. That was already underway, but it turned a slow practical case into an urgent national one, and the work carried on with a new and grim seriousness. On the 23rd of October 1978, the new southern airport, named Reina Sofia, opened to its first flights, and only weeks later the Queen of Spain came in person to inaugurate it. In that first year alone, it handled more than 1 million passengers. The dry, bright, fog-free south at last had a door that the whole of Northern Europe could fly straight through, landing minutes from the hotels instead of an hour in a mountain range away, and fly through it they did. What followed was one of the fastest transformations of any coastline anywhere in Europe. The south could now offer exactly the package the mainland had perfected, with one advantage none of its rivals could match: its winters were warm. While the beaches of Spain and Italy emptied out in October, the sun kept shining on Tenerife straight through Christmas, and the charter airlines built their schedules around it. Through the 1980s and into the 90s, cheap flights poured British and German and Scandinavian holidaymakers into Reina Sofia by the plane load, and the resort raced along the shore to meet them, hotel by hotel and apartment block by apartment block. Playa de las Americas became a byword, above all in Britain, for the package holiday in its purest form. Sun, a pool, full board, and a dense strip of bars and clubs a few hundred metres long, known simply as Veronica's, which by the end of the 1990s had grown notorious enough to be turned into its own late-night British television series back home. For a whole generation of Britons, this single stretch of reclaimed lava became the seaside, only warmer, and with the sunshine all but guaranteed. And yet every one of those aircraft was bringing people who would sleep and shower and swim on an island with no rivers of its own. For years, almost nobody stopped to do the arithmetic. When the island finally did the sum, the answer would empty its reservoirs and put tens of thousands of its own residents out onto the streets in protest. But that reckoning was still decades away, and in the meantime the numbers moved in only one direction, and that direction was up. Look first at what happened to the people. In 1970, the municipality of Arona, which contains much of the resort, was home to fewer than 11,000 people. By the start of 2024, it held more than 86,000. Its neighbour Adéjé climbed even faster, from around 14,000 residents at the turn of the century to more than 50,000 just 2 decades later, a rise of more than 250%, which made it the fastest growing town in the entire Canary Islands. Farmland and lava had become, inside a single working life, a densely built coastal city. The sheer scale of the building is hard to picture until you count the beds. By the same point, just 5 municipalities at the 2 ends of the island held nearly 121,000 tourist places between them, more than 9 in every 10 of all the tourist beds on Tenerife. Adéjé alone, in 2023, recorded the highest hotel occupancy of any resort area in the Canary Islands and the highest revenue per available room anywhere in the archipelago. The empty lava of the 1960s now carried high-rise hotels, water parks, shopping streets, and a string of golf courses, kept an improbable green in one of the driest corners of Europe. The poorest quarter of the island had quietly become its single most profitable one, and still they came. That same year, Tenerife took in more than 7 million tourists, part of more than 15 million who came to the Canary Islands as a whole. Its great volcano alone drew a reported record of well over 5 million visitors, an average of more than 14,000 people a day making their way towards a single mountaintop. An island of fewer than 1 million residents was hosting the population of a small country over and over every single year. To understand the reckoning that followed, you have to understand where the water comes from, because Tenerife has no rivers to dam and no natural lakes to draw down. For more than a century, islanders have gone looking for water by tunnelling for it. Generation after generation, they drove galleries, narrow horizontal mine shafts, straight into the flanks of the volcano, some of them running for kilometres in the dark, to reach the water trapped inside the rock. Laid end to end, those tunnels are thought to run for more than 2,000 kilometres, an underground network many times longer than the island is wide. Water on Tenerife had never simply fallen from the sky and run down to the sea. For as long as people had lived on the island, it had to be searched for, dug out of the rock, and paid for. 3 decades ago, almost every drop the island drank was hauled up from beneath its own surface. The beaches, the pools, and the green golf courses of the south all rest, in a sense, on water dragged out of the dark. The trouble, in the end, was simple arithmetic. A tourist in a southern hotel uses far more water than a local family does at home. By figures cited during the crisis, a hotel guest can get through close to 400 litres a day, roughly 4 times the 200 or so litres used by a resident, while the island's own water managers have spoken of trying to press residents down towards 150. One study in 2026 put the tourism industry's share of all the water the island consumes at more than 1/10 of the total, and found that a single guest in a 4-star hotel could account for well over 200 litres a night, before a drop was spent on the gardens and the golf greens outside. Set those figures against 7 million visitors a year, and the sums stop being abstract very quickly. The island was routinely hosting many times its own population, and nearly every one of those guests expected a hot shower and a full pool at the end of the day. Then the rain simply stopped coming. After a run of unusually dry winters, the water was no longer there to be found. In 2024, the island government, the Cabildo, declared a formal water emergency, with the reservoirs that backed up the tunnel network sitting barely 1/3 full, down from around half only a year earlier. In some of the worst hit towns, people were forbidden from filling their swimming pools or washing their cars. An island that had sold itself to the world as one long, endless summer had to stand up and ask its own people to save every drop they could. It did not run short of tourists, it ran short of water. And it was not only the water that had changed, so had the people. By the start of that year, according to the island's own statistics, More of those living in the town of Adjay had been born outside Spain than had been born within it, more than 56 in every 100. In neighbouring Arona, the foreign-born had become a narrow majority as well. The resort had drawn the world so completely that in the two towns at its very heart, Spanish-born Canarians now lived as a minority in the places their own grandparents had farmed. At the same time, the cost of somewhere to live climbed clean out of the reach of the workers who cleaned the rooms and carried the drinks, as ordinary flats were handed over to holidaymakers who would pay more for a single week than a local family could afford in a month. And so the coast that had spent 60 years pleading with the world to come began, at last, to ask it to stop. In April of 2024, tens of thousands of people marched right across the Canary Islands beneath a single slogan that the islands had a limit. The organisers put their numbers in the hundreds of thousands across the whole archipelago. The authorities counted a good deal fewer, but nobody seriously disputed that it was the largest movement of its kind the islands had ever seen. That October, the protest came to the resort itself. Demonstrators walked out onto the sand of Playa de las Americas, stood on the very ground the entire story had been built to fill, and held up signs asking the tourists all around them to think about what a cheap week in the sun actually cost. They marched again the following spring, out across the islands once more, their demands hardening into calls for a freeze on new tourist building and for limits on the rents that were pushing local families out of the towns their own families had always lived in. The pushback reached even the mountain. From the first day of 2026, the great volcano that crowns the island, free to climb throughout the whole of its history, stopped being free to outsiders. Visitors from beyond the Canary Islands now had to pay a charge of up to €25 to enter the national park, while islanders still walked in for nothing, and the number of people allowed to climb to the very summit each day was capped at a few hundred and had to be booked well in advance. It was not the island's first such measure. 2 years earlier, it had already begun rationing and charging for entry to the Masca Ravine, one of its most photographed walks. But the volcano was the greater symbol. The national park around it had been recognised by the United Nations as a place of world heritage, a wonder that had drawn people for as long as anyone had come to Tenerife, and now, for the first time, seeing it up close came with a price for anyone who did not live on the islands. As for the water, it was the weather, in the end, that broke the emergency. A run of storms early in 2026 dumped enough rain and snow across the island, some of it onto the high slopes of the volcano itself, to lift the reservoirs from little more than 40% of their capacity at the turn of the year to around 2/3 full within weeks. And in the first days of March, the island lifted the emergency it had lived under since 2024. The relief had fallen from the sky. Nothing about the way the coast used its water had changed at all. And the island's leaders, having looked over the edge, announced a new water plan for the decade ahead, carrying a price tag of more than €1 billion, spent to make sure the island would never again come so close to running dry. 60 years earlier, a Catalan industrialist had bought a stretch of dry volcanic ground that grew almost nothing, given it a name borrowed from another continent, and sold it to the world as paradise. He was right about the sunshine. The sunshine was always going to come, because it was the one thing this coast had ever held in endless supply, and it cost nothing at all to ship in. Everything else had to be brought or built or invented or pumped. The sand was engineered into the bays, the palm trees were carried in from the mainland, the visitors were flown in through an airport built in the shadow of a catastrophe, and the water, the one thing that no bulldozer and no clever name could ever conjure, was dragged mile by mile out of the inside of a volcano, until one dry year there was simply not enough of it left to go round. The impossible rise of the south of Tenerife was entirely real. A wasteland genuinely did become an empire, but an empire that has to import the very ground beneath its own feet is only ever borrowing against a bill it cannot see. And on this coast the bill at last came due in the one currency the desert had never once accepted on credit: water. If a story told this way holds your attention, the video already waiting on your screen was picked because there is a very good chance it will hold it too.